I mean, they're great stuff. So I got Paul Kurtz here as an internationally recognized expert on cybersecurity and is the co-founder and CEO of Trustar Technology. Paul has been working on cybercrime. He began his working at the cybercrime at the White House in the late 1990s. He served as a senior position related to critical infrastructure and counterterrorism on the White House's National Security and Homeland Security Councils under President Clinton and Bush. After leaving government, Paul has held numerous private sector cybersecurity positions, including founding the Cybersecurity Industry Alliance, which is acquired by Tech America, the executive director of Safe Code, the managing partner of Good Harbor Consulting in Abu Dhabi, and the CISO at Cyberpoint International. Our second speaker is Heather Nickerson. She serves as Red 5's Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer. As EVP, she serves as a primary advisor to the CEO and the Red 5 corporate management team and advises private families, family offices, and corporate clients on a variety of sensitive topics. Let's welcome Paul and Heather.
Good morning. Thank you all for attending this morning, and thank you, Byron, for hosting us and inviting us to speak on supply chain security. We are today going to tee up both the physical and the digital side of supply chain security and walk you through a case study that underscores the importance of why you need both digital and physical elements. Over our careers, Paul and I have had overlapping careers across the past couple of decades. We're both recovering government officials or servants. I was also former CIA, senior analyst. I spent more time doing non-analytic functions at the agency than I did actually being an analyst. I served as a PDB, Presidential Daily Briefer, the commanding general in country in Afghanistan. I also served 2 years at the White House, where Paul was. I was working on an executive order task force at the time. Since coming to Red 5, our paths have continued to cross, both on the cyber and the physical side, working with a variety of Fortune 100 corporations, and also in the private family offices space. With that, I'll let Paul do a brief intro of his background and experiences, and then we'll kick off the presentation.
All right, thank you. Paul Kurtz, it's a pleasure to be here. We come down to Dallas quite a bit, so it's in the 7-Eleven for us, so thank you. It's great to be here. Just a little more color and perspective of as Heather and I kind of bat this back and forth on cyber physical. I kind of tripped into the world of cybersecurity from the counterterrorism world. I spent a lot of time, though, even in the counterterrorism world, working on fusing intelligence data. So that would be, in the case of working at the White House, it was getting all the various agencies, including CIA, NSA, and others, FBI, to exchange data about what we knew about terrorists. And did that right before 9/11, and we all know what happened on 9/11. And I took some lessons learned out of 9/11 as far as the fusion of data began later, much later, to apply them to building out, starting and co-founding a company called Trustar, which is basically in the intelligence management fusion business. So we work with a lot of big enterprises and help them kind of better understand what's within their four walls and how they begin working with others. And I would say, just as a starter kit, so to speak, for looking at supply chain security, cyber, the one poster child case study I think I would recommend everybody try to look at if you have the opportunity is look at the Wired magazine article from 2018, which basically recaps what happened with Maersk, and which was basically a $10 billion hit against the economy. It wasn't just Maersk, it was Merck, the pharmaceutical company. FedEx's subsidiary in Europe took a hit, and there were many others. And so there's a lot of collateral damage that can be done, so to speak, in cyberspace. And you were talking earlier about, the cyber as the threat, at least the next 10 years, next decade. And we're all grappling to get our hands around it. So hopefully today, as we go back and forth, we will better position you to think about how you work the issue from the inside out, thinking about the physical security issues, the investigation issues, as well as the cyber prevention.
And as we kick off the presentation, we'd like to say if you have questions while we're speaking, please raise your hands. We'll be glad to answer them and address them during the presentation. We also plan to leave time at the end for Q&A. So we want this to be very flexible, very interactive. We enjoy speaking with you, not just at you. So with that said, let's start with what we plan to cover in our time allotted today. We are going to look at the step-by-step process of physical and digital aspects of supply chain security. We've seen over the course of our careers how you need both in order to effectively mitigate and address risks to the supply chain. Physical aspects alone can fail. Digital aspects alone can fail. So having both can ensure success when you're dealing with investigations and looking to further enhance security of the supply chain. We're also going to learn how to better address and better leverage the digital aspects. So Paul will go in depth into different recommendations for each phase and each process we're going to address today. We've broken up the presentation into 5 core steps into what we see with regards to investigating supply chain risk and issues. We're going to go through each step using a case study that had both physical and digital elements to illustrate the 5 steps that we're addressing. And then, of course, we'll leave time for Q&A. So starting off with the case study, this is back in 2009, 2010 timeframe. We had a very large telecommunications company come to us. They were an existing client, but they had at least thought they identified a supply chain problem, but they weren't entirely sure. They didn't really know where to start. What was happening was that they had a series of production facilities down in Central and South America that were producing parts for their products. Specifically, one of their facilities in Mexico had an issue where one day, 1 week, they'd have 200 parts disappear up the front or the back door. They would then have another distributor, also in Mexico, a week or 2 later, have 200 other parts disappear out the back door. So over the course of a month or two, they would see, with regards to all their Mexican distribution facilities and suppliers, that they would see the different components needed for their end product. In equal numbers, each component would have gone missing at some point during the production process. They initially thought it was just limited to the suppliers and distribution areas in Mexico. But as they started looking into it, they realized it was a much larger issue across Central and South America. Why did this matter to them? Obviously, it was because of the risk to their reputation, the threat of a counterfeit product on the marketplace. Because it was telecommunications, those that were assembling the end product were doing so not with the same standards as the actual production facilities. So there was an actual potential physical risk to end users if the wiring or other components weren't properly assembled by those who were using the stolen parts. The manufacturer itself wanted to ensure that reputation was protected, bottom line was protected, and the supply chain was protected. They were getting pressure from the board to address those issues. When they came to us, they came as a question. Do you think we should do an investigation? Is it worthwhile to do the investigation? Will we find anything? They had a lot of questions, but not a whole lot of information at the point. So we sat down, worked with them, and walked them through our 5-step process of how we would address the issue. The 5 steps, we'll go through each one, but it's understand, collect, analyze, take action, and then follow up. When presented with that path forward, they agreed to to let's see what we can find, and let's see if we mitigate, and hopefully put an end to this issue that was going on. So step one was, what's the investigative objective? And this is really important to understanding when you're setting up to start an investigation, when you think you have a supply chain issue, to understand what is the objective. Because different parties within the organization had different objectives. The board had one objective. The director of security had one objective. The CEO had one objective. They all had different concerns about what it was doing to the overall reputation and, reputation of the company, but also security of the supply chain. But they were all slightly different. So getting all of them in the room together or in different interviews to determine for them what was the objective and what for them was a win. Was it to protect the company, the reputation, the people, the assets? We then had to decide whether to investigate. So walking through that, they were all in agreement that investigation was warranted. The risk was too large not to investigate. The next step was understanding the resources that were available to us as part of the investigation, but also the resources they had in-house to deal with the investigation, and then what would be the results of the investigation. So, when thinking about what resources are internal, the CEO had to walk through and understand, would he involve HR? Would he involve legal? What role did the security director play in this? What role did the CISO play in this? Because you're thinking about the investigation, it's not just physical. There's also a very large digital element as well. Is the investigation, is it for informational purposes? If it's not, if you're going to think about going and taking legal action on this, the general counsel, outside counsel, those are all resources you'd have to consider. In this instance, the board actually made it really easy for the C-suite team. They mandated the investigation at the end once they were briefed by the corporate team, and then they delegated the action to the VP of security. So very early on, the board identified a single point of contact for this entire process. All the other players were still involved. C-suite, the more tactical on-the-ground regional managers that were identified as trusted colleagues, but they had a single point of contact throughout this process. And then last but not least is understanding the return on the investment. Early on, we had to educate the different key stakeholders that we could at the end figure out exactly what was going on, but then were they willing to take the necessary steps and actions? They also understand that we could go through the investigative process, collect, analyze, but then we may not have a firm answer. Or we could have an answer, but it could have very large PR implications for the company. So truly understanding what we could get into at the end and what that would mean for them was all part of this process. Paul, do you want to take the digital side?
Sure. So just a couple questions here. How many people here have been kind of, when we share performance involved, like the intelligence community, with military intelligence, kind of came out in the security space where you're trying to grapple with what are the key intelligence requirements? Do you have anybody with that kind of experience? I suspect there's probably a few. Okay. How many of you are working directly on cybersecurity issues? So, see, 2. Okay. Tangentially for cybersecurity. Okay. I ask because I'm just curious. Because one of the things that is starting to happen in the marketplace today is fusion centers being set up to look at both physical and cyber, and it relates to how you grapple with the around cybersecurity. So to be concrete, given many of you are associated with the retail space, like Home Depot wanting to bring pieces together, physical cyber, in one place. Sally Mae wanting to bring physical cyber fraud, same place. Equifax thinking the same. So as you hear me talk about cyber, if you're not connected with your cyber associates investigations, I try to connect. And I think one way of beginning that process is by understanding a little more inside your enterprise what systems you're using to flag suspicious activities on cyber systems. So many of you probably heard of a company like Splunk, security incident event management system, or a case management system like ServiceNow or Jira. Many of you may be using case management systems like that, or vulnerability scanning systems, or endpoint detection response systems like CrowdStrike's. All of those systems become relevant, and the challenge is to, if you will, identify those systems early, sooner, not later, as to what you lean on in order to understand what's going on inside your network. So it's, if you will, an inventory. And I'd ask, as you think about this space, don't forget about fraud and abuse. There's a lot of fraud and abuse activities, in this case study, that can relate into the physical world and more directly into the cyber. So in a case of the cloud security environment, the cloud environment, IBM Cloud, big operation here in Dallas, and a customer of ours, one of the things they want to focus on is making sure if there's abuse activity, meaning someone is misusing IBM's resources and abusing it and using it to attack, if you will, other parties. They want to make sure they can get their hands around that very quickly. And so they wanted to pull the systems together associated with that. Well, one of the problems that the cloud community has identified when you think about supply chain, just abuse of things that can happen, when IBM got next to Rackspace, which is another Texas company, they started looking at bad guys and how they were firing up and abusing systems. And the bad guys were basically using the same credentials. They would spin up a capability on IBM Cloud, and they would fire downrange, and IBM would figure it out. And they shut the guy down, and then the person would go using the very same credentials over to Rackspace and use their credentials over there to do bad things. So there's a lot to take into account when you look at fraud and abuse as well. Supply chain, a very interesting story in the retail space of how you take into account the status of supply chain. I'm gonna push it out just a little bit to the side. Think about, many of you may have joint venture partners. 60% of the attacks that occur come through the supply chain. So think about your JV partners, who you're working with, your third-party suppliers. Take them into account as you think about internal understanding of what's going on inside your company. Bring all those pieces together. So that can sound like a daunting task. It's not that bad. But one of the reasons why I asked the very first question about who might be associated or had some experience in the intelligence community, it really helps an enterprise, if you haven't done so already, to establish what you might call an enterprise intelligence officer. Someone who's keeping an inventory of what you know about yourself. That's not necessarily the person who's monitoring the press of every threat that's going on out there. You'll go nuts. You've got to understand what you're using yourself to protect yourself and come to terms with that. And a EIO, it sounds like an old phrase like the kid's poem, whatever it is. But an enterprise intelligence officer can help. It doesn't mean it has to be at the C level, but someone who has that level of understanding across the entire enterprise.
And that's, again, why understanding is critical across physical, but also digital. So understand, like Paul said, understand what you have internally, understand what the external issue is, understand who the key stakeholders are, understand what you can and you're willing to do about it as you start down this process. So the first step is understand. The second step is collect. And back to our case study with the Central and South American multinational telecommunications firm that was having the issues. So in working with that entity, we had to understand, how do we collect the data? And Paul will get into the digital side of how do you best collect that, which in some ways can be a bit easier than the physical side. But the physical side required boots on the ground for interviews and for actual, in some cases, surveillance, and just documenting what was going on at those locations where they knew that the theft was occurring. So one of the first steps was, once we understood, was working very closely with the teams to identify key people in the area that could help us collect the information. We used outside third parties to do some of the collection of evidence, photographic evidence, or surveilling those that we knew or thought to be involved in the operation. But we also need someone on the inside to help us collect data points from the organization. So shipping bills, production logs, all those data points showing what was actually supposed to be produced or was being produced but wasn't being shipped. So working with a team, we identified a manager in a South American country who was a trusted official from corporate headquarters. We made the decision very early on to limit local involvement to those that could be vetted, trusted partners. This individual, this manager, was one of those people. So we began to collect the potential physical and digital evidence. He worked with us to send us the items we were requesting from it. So different shipping logs, different logins, badge in, badge out records, all of those pieces that could help us put together what we needed to understand the full scope of the issue. He was able to assist with that. We asked for the internal documents. We ensured that when we were using him, that he had a very ostensible reason to be asking for everything he was asking for. We didn't want to set him up to be in question as to why was he doing this? What right did he have to do this? So we made sure that the person we chose to be on the inside collecting for us not only was a trusted partner, but also had a real reason to be obtaining the information he was asking for from those he was working with. From the physical side, that took a lot of time to get set up, put in place. It was an exercise in patience as the corporate headquarters had to decide and discuss which person to use and how they were going to do this. What was great, though, was working with the digital side. We could actually get a head start in some of the collection because there was a lot of information that was available digitally to us. So though the physical side was a bit slower to get up and running, digitally we kicked off fairly quickly, and we worked in tandem. So you had both collection efforts yielding information. So Paul, digital.
So we've taken the steps to understand what's going on, identify various sources to give you an understanding of suspicious activity. The next step is to collect that and begin to add data. So the first point I would make here is to bring that data together in a place that it can be correlated and enriched. And you'd be surprised as to how much you know across your enterprise. I sat down with a major credit card provider yesterday, and they had 17 divisions that all had various pieces of security. I'm talking physical security, fraud, abuse, to typical security operations center. They're trying to rationalize that. And then the second piece I would underscore is the challenge that many enterprises have, why they had 17 different divisions and why other companies have 5 or 6, is because of there are different levels of responsibility within an organization. People have different functions and roles. Major insurance company in New Jersey has, and you all may have come from this walk, what they call it a high-tech investigations unit, HTI. And they were following up on their own employees and own team, trying to understand what was happening physically inside their 4 walls, including involving digital equipment, whether it be carrying a laptop, going overseas, or whatever it be. So the HTIU guys were doing their work and literally pouring all their data into Excel spreadsheets and going blind trying to understand and trying to correlate. And would only be able to understand what's happening in the digital world if they happen to be standing next to the Slurpee machine and talking to a guy from the SOC. And they would learn that there was actually a relationship between some of the things they were looking at. And so the challenge, though, was you didn't want the Security Operations Center guys knowing exactly what the internal investigation guys were up to. So they were able to position themselves in such a way that the high-tech investigations unit had access to all the data that they had, obviously, about their investigations, but they could now see down into what was going on to the SOC, the Security Operations Center. And likewise, they stood up another capability to look at fraud and abuse. So permissions-based approach and the point on anonymization is important as well. You may want to begin exchanging data across the enterprise, but you want to make sure you can do so in such a way that you can protect or redact personally identifiable information. There may be supply chain partners that you'd prefer not to disclose to everyone, but still try to collect data about what might be going on. So the third point I would make here is, as much as you're very focused internally on your data sets, what's going on inside your enterprise, now you can start to factor in what you might know from parties outside your company. Threat data. And threat data comes in many different forms. There can be threat data that might come from the government. You could have, some of you may be part of the NCFTA, the National Cyber Fraud Training Alliance. Some of you may be a part of an information sharing analysis center with one of the sectors of the economy, like retail or finance or whatever it might be. You may be using a proprietary threat feed, like Flashpoint or Intel 471 or Digital Shadows or whatever it may be. You can bring all that into play, bring it together in one place to have a better understanding so you can work with your colleagues wherever they might be in the physical space, in the physical investigations, and have an understanding that you know what you know about yourself and you're cognizant of the threat around you. And so many times, you can be distracted by what's the latest thing in the press, the latest NotPetya attack, the latest WannaCry attack, the latest meltdown on firmware or whatever it might be, but you're forgetting about what's going on inside your own enterprise. But if you aggregate that all together and have a good understanding, it's far easier to use that threat data and bring it into play and then begin to engage all your supply chain partners. Because if you don't know enough about yourself, you're not going to be able to do jack your supply chain partners. You're going to be flying blind. So you've got to start with yourself and then work out to your supply chain partners.
And in doing so, you have to think through, too, who needs to know. So who has access to know, but then also who needs to know as part of this investigative process. So internally, but then also externally. That's a really big component as you collect the data, you anonymize the data, but then also how do you distribute it and who does it go to?
So, great question. So how do you, when you take in the data and you're aggregating it one place, how do you make sure it remains sound? So to speak, have chain of custody, auditing controls on access to that data. It's after I kind of expanded the question. Okay. Really important point. When you go down this road, you want to make sure you're using a capability that has access and permissions control with auditing capability. That also means that those who have access to it have the appropriate privileges. In other words, you don't necessarily want somebody able to go on there and have write capabilities when they shouldn't have write capabilities, to write over data, to potentially corrupt what you're looking at. So what we've been able to do, and we support a lot of investigations, in many different types of enterprises, we use an approach, and this is not all about Trustar. There's a lot of companies you can go to. But in a case of, I can speak to Trustar, what we do is we take all that data, we put into what we call a private enclave, a repository. The sourcing of that data is not lost in translation. In other words, that remains attached to it. So if it's a ServiceNow ticket, if it's another source you're bringing into play, it all remains in the enclave. And then you can leverage the external data, know the source, know the scoring associated with the validity of the source if you want to, and keep that access. And the cool thing about what you're doing is you're developing a historical archive for everything you know about what's occurred in your company. So if you have SIM data, ticketing data, orchestration data, EDR data, getting way too tech, but it's all. And the physical sensor data, so we have either on the physical sensor side, we have some banking and financial institutions, which are kind of like usually on the front edge. They are starting to take data associated with card readers, license plate recognition, and video recognition as well, and be able to integrate that into the enclave itself so they can put everything together. But you can access only those who are supposed to have access to it as you wish. That's under your control. Make sense? Did I answer? Okay.
And just to add on the physical side, we had a separate instance in an African country, 12 months, a human collection platform, collecting on-the-ground information. We worked very closely with the general counsel and the legal team in country, but also back at the U.S. headquarters. And we had the correct headers, footers, created the correct filing systems, all the things we used to do back at FBI, CIA to ensure that when the information was collected on the physical side, the reports were drafted. The report writer, like all the information that was required was inputted into the system, was sent direct to legal. Depending on what it was we were collecting, some were also notarized. We followed the protocol set up by the General Counsel's office to ensure that everything was documented and maintained in a very precise manner. So when they did go to court years later, they had all that they needed, and it was not in question as to how it was collected and what the sources were. So moving on to step 3 of the process, analyze. On the physical security side, the most important part of this is connecting the dots. So now that you've collected all the dots, how do you connect them? And what are you connecting? And I'll tell a little story about something that stuck with me for all these years. Back when I was a junior analyst and going through basically analyst boot camp, we had a very senior director of it's called DI, but Director of Intelligence, come down to lecture our course program. And he talked about how do you connect the dots? How do you know what it is you're connecting, and how do you ensure that what you're connecting is accurate? This is back when we used to have those overhead projectors with the laminate slides you could put on and off. So he went up on the stage and he had a bunch of dots on the screen, and he asked us what it looked like. And of course, as a bunch of junior analysts, you're like, oh my gosh, is this a test? Like, what are they looking for? What am I supposed to say? And we had a bunch of different, like, well, it could be this or it could be that. He put his first laminate cover down, and the lines that he had drawn connected all the dots, and it was a bunny. Like, all right, that's cute, bunny. Pulled it off, said, what else could you make with those dots? He put the next slide down, and it was a bomb. The same exact dots, but drawing the lines differently, actually made a bomb with a little lighted fuse at the end. So the lesson there was, when you connect the dots, are you looking at the bunny or the bomb? And it really depends on how you connect those dots. And that's why the collection part is so critical. What are you collecting? Have you collected all that there is to collect? Move into analyzation of data. How do you look at it? What are you looking at? If you have an analysis team in-house, or even if you outsource the analysis piece, understanding what their mindsets and biases are. Are there any biases they have towards the data set or towards the investigation? We all as humans naturally have certain mindsets and certain biases, but it's important when you're analyzing data to put those aside and look at the data very objectively. It's also important when you have those dots, you're analyzing it, to ask yourself, what are you missing? Are there key pieces of information that you need that you don't currently have? And if so, can you identify new leads based on the analysis? Are there other people you should be talking to? Are there other questions you should be asking? Are there other resources you need? Do you need to pull more in from the cyber side to get more data from behind the scenes? Do you need to look more at different physical security techniques? Do you need to do surveillance or counter surveillance? Do you need to dig a bit deeper? Sometimes those leads come to light very quickly. Other times it does take a lot of effort to pull at the threads and see what you can get. But it's definitely worth it in the long run. In our case study, that meant that as the analyst team analyzed the data, they kept generating follow-on questions for that regional manager to go back and ask. So he had to be in the right social situations. We had to engineer that a little bit, but he had to go back and ask follow-on questions. Again, it was a very time-consuming process to do all this, but that is how we got some of the best data that then helped us confirm, was it the bunny or the bomb? In this case, it ended up being the bomb. And the theft ring was much larger than initially expected. It wasn't just in Mexico. It extended all the way through Central and South America. But had we not asked those questions and pulled at those threads to get those new leads, we might not have actually learned that part of the investigation. It could have very easily been just contained to Mexico had that not been developed. Another big factor in when analyzing the information is deciding on next steps. When do you go from covert to overt? And on the physical side, this is a much larger deal. Paul can talk a bit more about on the digital side where it's a little bit easier to blend the lines. But on the physical side, there's a very distinct move from covertly collecting data and information and analyzing it to them publicly announcing the company is doing an investigation. The company has found this and is now going to do more questioning, more data collection. It's easy on the covert side to collect data, check public records, covert surveillance, phone records. That can be done. When you decide to go overt, though, you may get more information based on if there's leads coming from the public or others. You could also potentially get less information because now the bad guys may know. That's a decision you have to weigh very carefully with your team when you consider that. With regards to the case study, the company decided to stay covert due to local labor and local criminal elements. When they sat down and assessed the risk of what going overt would do, the risk that those local adversaries and bad actors and labor unions, that was not worth them the potential reward of additional information. They felt they had collected enough on the covert side to make a very compelling case for what they were trying to do, but that going overt would do more harm than good. But that was a very carefully deliberated decision on their part. They chose purposely not to interview local workers on the manufacturing line and in the vendor community. That, in the end, limited part of what they could do legally, and we'll get into that towards the end. But again, that was a decision they made during this step of analyzing the data because they had to decide what was going to be back to the ROI, what was the return on investment from doing this extra overt action. Paul, do you want to talk about digital on the side?
Yeah, I think the first set of points are more focused on type of platform, software. But I think it'd probably be better if I tell just a quick story. I haven't really talked about it inside of threat. Thinking about it inside of threats. We had a situation with a customer that they were convinced they had an insider threat, that somebody was eating the organization from inside out. And it was a Thursday. They had determined that it was an insider. And they stood up their war room, so to speak, to bring all the right folks together to figure out who this insider was. And they were ramping up, calling people in for the weekend, and then they took the data of what they knew that they convinced themselves that this was an insider problem, and then they analyzed it with what they knew from external sources, and very quickly realized they were experiencing a whole bunch of other companies that experienced the very same thing. They did not have an inside problem. They convinced themselves, think funny bomb. They convinced themselves that they had a bomb on the inside. Actually, they had a problem, but it wasn't an inside. It was something that was going on outside, an external vulnerability that had been taken advantage of. But they emotionally, they had brought themselves to the point that it was an inside. So fortunately, they were able to figure it out fast, stand down on bringing up the war room, save themselves a boatload of cash because they were able to understand what was going on inside the company compared with what's going on outside. So that leads to the second set of points is that, there is an evaluation process here. And being able to, I have a line that's like, nobody's ready to turn computer security over to computers. Despite all the stuff you hear about artificial intelligence and the magnificent things it's going to do to help us on security, we're nowhere close to being in that state. There is going to be a human in the loop, and that does mean that there's going to be a human applying the inferences that he or she can make in order to connect the dots, but obviously in a way that is not biased. And the second piece that I would say on this one, the second item I would point to is that if you're using a case management system, have some discipline associated with that case management system. What are the protocols? What are the rules of the road? What is the workflow associated with if you have an analyst working on it, whether it's involved in the physical space or cyberspace, working on digital event? It's making sure you're not comparing apples and oranges as far as protocols as handling data. The good news is there are capabilities out there today that can automatically update a case management system with new data that may be available on the digital side. Obviously, harder to do on the physical side and to some degree, but it's the idea of updating a ticket that's been created, look into a particular event that you are investigating, it can be automatically updated. But try not to apply the bias and analysis, because this is where it can get ugly, make bad decisions.
And that's a really hard thing to do, is not apply bias to analysis. So moving on to step 4, taking action. So once the case is built, it's important to consider the presentation and the audience. Are you presenting to the General Counsel? Are you presenting to the board? Are you presenting to local law enforcement or national law enforcement or international law enforcement? Who is going to be the end consumer of your data or your evidence? Who is going to then help you take action? In the case study, it was the VP of Security who was briefing the case to the General Counsel, and the investigations we referenced to local law enforcement in the country where the infractions were occurring. This presented a unique situation where we had the VP briefing the GC, of course in English, but then local law enforcement had to be briefed in dual English and Spanish. So we had to bring in translators to help us with the briefing. So one of those things you typically don't always think about going down this path, but that was when we encountered, as part of this process, thinking through who the audience was. It's a small thing, but it's one of those little nuances that is important to think through, like who are you briefing, who's the audience, what resources do they need to understand what it is you're briefing them on. Second step is coordinate internally across the different departments. So once we had the data, we analyzed it, the VP briefed the GC. There was then a series of follow-on briefings through HR, through marketing, public relations, through all the different departments that had stakes in the issue that we had uncovered. And that would, going forward, they'd then have to, on their own, have measures to mitigate or remediate. When briefing and discussing with them, consider what is the likely outcome. Consider what actions they all have to take, and then what resources they need to take those actions. It's not enough on the security side to simply have this is the plan, but if no one on your team or few on your team have resources to execute the plan, it's not going to help you mitigate it from the security side. So think through those questions, understand what they need, understand who needs to be on the team to fully resolve the issue to take action. You may also, one thing to think about when you get to this step is you may decide not to take action. And this goes back to what we're talking about with the local entities, covert, overt. They decide not to go overt. They also decided not to take action in certain countries because they knew, working with their legal team, they didn't have enough information in certain areas. So they purposely chose in some countries to pursue action, in other countries not to pursue action. That's a legitimate decision when it comes to step 4, taking action. It's understanding when do you take action, when do you not take action, and what are the costs of doing so in both cases.
So you can say, I think the question you asked her earlier, I think I covered most of the points here. Two real quick items to kind of bring things to life as far as taking action issues. I think many people are familiar with the Equifax problem. And in cyberspace, one of the challenges we have is there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there, and there are limited resources to address those vulnerabilities. Every CISO, it's a huge challenge. I don't know of a CISO that has all the resources to address every vulnerability that's been identified in the system. It's just not possible, unfortunately. We're getting better on the technology side, but it's going to be a problem for a long time. So that means deciding to take action can be a little more challenging because there are going to be some vulnerabilities you might not get to. And so thinking through and understanding what are the most commonly exploited vulnerabilities, and if there are warnings that are coming out from the federal government or from a security threat provider or somebody like that, to take those into account. And unfortunately, many of the big hacks, including NotPetya, which caused $10 billion of damage, there was a patch, there was a notification of the vulnerability patch that was available a couple of weeks before NotPetya hit. And so it is the take action in cyberspace, covert versus overt, is a little bit different in this case, because it's have a system in place to address those vulnerabilities, have some communication with the physical world, whomever is responsible for your physical security, to make sure when you're thinking about those vulnerabilities, do those vulnerabilities affect your supply chain? Do those vulnerabilities affect your physical access? I think so often cyber people can be so focused looking at systems and trying to keep your systems secure and are addressing vulnerabilities, but they're not necessarily taking into account the vulnerabilities associated with physical access. So once again, communication is extremely important. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that for this when we go to 5.
And then last but not least, follow-up. So in this instance, on the physical side, once you've taken action and whatever you did has occurred, it's not enough to simply say, we're done, that was great. Continue to monitor, continue to look for remediations. 9 times out of 10, a problem in our large corporate clients, they have an issue in one geographic area. They may have the same issue elsewhere, so continue to monitor, continue to remediate. Just go in eyes wide open. Don't think that because you've resolved it, this one instance, it won't come back up again. The other thing that we always recommend is lessons learned. Take a moment to collect the original team back together and sit down and do lessons learned or an after-action report and understand truly what can you take away to make your corporation smarter for future instances. In this case, working with the corporation and the board, what their key takeaways were, there were pervasive organized crime and labor issues in certain countries. And then regardless of steps that they took, they were never going to overcome those issues. So from a strategic standpoint, the board then essentially instructed them to consider where else could they go for supply chain? Where else could they house their production facilities? And that led them, nearly now 8-9 years later, they are relocating production facilities in other countries. Rather than trying to change the endemic corruption in key countries where they were, they decided that the longer-term solution was to actually reevaluate the supply chain and make smarter geographic decisions. So it's that type of discussion afterwards that I think can lead to a longer-term, more successful result, rather than just saying we did one investigation, we solved one issue. Really, what is the root cause of that? So that is where I think there is tremendous value in lessons learned and talking to the entire team.
So my final point is here on micro exchanges. There are barstool exchanges that take place where you guys are grabbing beer or something like that after work on a weekend and exchanging data about what you those are healthy. Keep them up. Talking person to person is vital. Exchanging data. Organizations like Trustar that is active down here. Other organizations that can be helpful to you. There are information sharing organizations that are out there as well that you might want to think about joining for your particular sector, whatever industry, city. But I would also suggest you consider exchanging data in real time with important supply chain partners or JV partners. I think there's a lot at risk if you're relying upon the barstool phone network to exchange data. Let me give you a good example of how I see this coming to life today. I have actually two. One, an insurance company sitting across from Chief Security Officer, CSO, not a CISO, that said, I'd really like to form a treehouse where I have my supply chain partners and even peers in my industry to be able to come together and exchange data. I think that is exceptionally healthy approach to taking us to the next level to address problems in cyberspace. And fortunately now there's technology available that enables that. The second example I would give you, which is more at the senior level that you might hear perking within companies now, very large food and beverage company. The board of directors directed that the knowledge that the mothership knew about itself in cyberspace needed to be pushed out to all of their JV partners. And they have 30-some JV partners around the world. And that sounds like a really good, benign thing to do, attaboy, be smart, protect your supply chain partners. But what was really interesting about what the board wanted to do was when they made that data available, they wanted the metrics to understand whether or not their JV or supply chain partners were actually using it. So in other words, were the supply chain partners, the JV partners, actually taking the steps to defend themselves when they made the data available? And they wanted to measure that. They wanted to make sure that if there was vulnerability data or there was a hack that was out that was germane to their industry, they were pushing it out, they wanted to make sure that that data was available to them, but they wanted to measure the access. So when a balloon goes up and you made data available to the supply chain partner didn't take advantage of that data, unfortunately, a lot of this is going to come down to legal challenges in the end. And everybody's going to be looking at the bottom line. They're going to be looking at brand. Reason why this particular entity did it is because of their brand. Because a hack against one of their JV partners would be a hack against a brand. And John Q. Public wouldn't recognize the difference of the brand, even though it was a JV partner that might have been walled off in another part of the world. So think about that as you think through your strategy as to whether or not you are part of a supply chain and you're asked to do something and you may be measured on it ultimately, or you have the position or you have the possibility of asking that of your supply chain. I would take both into account. stop.
And with that, we will stop for questions.
Or criticism.
On the physical side, did this company engage law enforcement once they determined that they had a breach, or did they wait till the end and then determine whether or not they're only going to engage local law enforcement?
So the question was whether or not on the physical side the company decided to engage law enforcement when they first discovered the breach, or did they wait until the end and then engage local law enforcement? So in this case, they waited until the end to engage local law enforcement when they had all the facts. They wanted to make sure that they understood the full issue at play. They wanted to collect the evidence, and then because of the area in the world where this was occurring, they thought they'd have very little legal recourse until they fully built the case.
Like Mexico.
Like Mexico. And even then, it was a challenge.
Other questions? Comments?
So earlier we talked about the use of the mobile devices. Albert talked about that. Some of the questions came up. The risk is enormous, right? From a cyber, where it's hitting, where it's going, how many channels it passes through. What's on the horizon for mobile? Anything that you know about what's going on with mobile for protection?
I think that there are at least two vectors of attack. There's the device itself, and the producer of the device, whether or not it's an Android device, an Apple device. I think the producers of the devices are doing a better job trying to lock them down. But what I am most concerned about are the apps that we put on those devices and the permissions associated with those apps. And so from an enterprise perspective, a lot of your people are probably using phones for business, and they have email flowing through there, and they're using other social media apps to communicate. Unfortunately, a lot of the apps that are out there putting on phones are not in shape. And so from an integrity of communications issues, from a privacy perspective of geolocation, I had a person talk to me 2 days ago. I've been in San Francisco for the past few days because it's the RSA Security Conference. 45,000 geeks descend upon San Francisco and drink a lot and tell war stories. And then the marketeers try to sell more stuff. But thank you for the escape. It's nice to be here. But I have to go back after this. But one of the stories was very interesting to me. In a country overseas that is an enemy of ours, the men are being very discreet about what apps they put on the phone. The women, partners of the men, are not. And countries are beginning to target the men through the women because of the apps on the phone. That is just the beginning of what we see. So I think my bet is that it's going on now. Come on. I mean, with everything going on Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and all that, everybody's become more aware of the inappropriate sharing of data. It should not be occurring. But this next level is the misuse of those apps by others, by bad guys, in order to target people for whatever reason they might want. I don't know if my little story makes sense, but I see the mobile phone market, our mobility, right now it's a focus on the phone, but in the presentation you offered, phone is just the beginning. We get into an IoT world, it's not going to be good. But I come back to my point again, the only way we're going to combat this and get our hands around it is if we stop operating in silos and begin to link up and do micro-sharing work micro exchanges, begin to at least work inside enterprise to exchange data, and then be able to start to work with others, and we can kind of get ahead. So, long answer. I don't more color. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, but anyway, I appreciate it.